William Carter always believed that promises were small coins in the pocket of a man's character, easy to spend, harder to replace. Yet as the years slipped by, one particular promise he had made weighed heavier than all the rest. It was a promise given not to a stranger nor to a friend, but to his only son, Daniel. And though William thought time would dull its sharp edge, fate had a way of sharpening it again when he least expected. The story begins in the late 1960s, in a modest house on the outskirts of a bustling American town. The Carters were not poor, but they lived carefully. William worked long hours at the steel plant. His hands were thick with calluses, his shirt smelling faintly of smoke and iron. His wife, Elaine, kept the home warm with the scent of fresh bread and lavender soap. Their son Daniel, a boy of 10 with eager eyes, idolized his father with a devotion only a child could hold. One evening in spring, after supper dishes had been washed and put away, Daniel followed his father out to the porch. The sun had melted into the horizon, leaving streaks of pink and orange across the sky. Fireflies blinked in the yard. Daniel clutched a baseball glove under his arm. "Dad," he asked softly, "do you think one day we can go to a real baseball game? Not just play in the backyard, but the big stadium in the city?" William, tired from a 12-hour shift, rubbed his forehead. He looked at his boy's eager face and smiled faintly. "Of course, Danny. One day soon. I promise." Those words, simple as they were, etched themselves deep into Daniel's memory. He carried them like a talisman through school days and summer nights, through small triumphs and quiet disappointments. He told his friends proudly, "My dad promised he'd take me to see the big game." But weeks became months, months became years. The steel plant demanded more of William's time. Overtime hours paid the bills, but they stole his evenings. When Daniel asked again, William always said, "Next season," or "when things slow down." The promise remained alive, but buried beneath the weight of responsibilities. By the time Daniel was in high school, his glove had grown stiff from disuse. His love for baseball lingered, but it was tinged with disappointment. Friends teased him when he repeated his father's promise. "You're still waiting?" They laughed. Daniel laughed too, but quietly. The words stung. William noticed the distance forming between them, but told himself it was part of growing up. He had forgotten, or perhaps chosen not to remember, how deeply children could measure love in fulfilled promises. One summer evening, Daniel asked one final time, "Dad, the team's in the playoffs. Everyone's going. Could we just this once?" William, bone-weary and focused on the bills spread across the kitchen table, barely looked up. "Not this year, Danny. I'll make it up to you, I swear." It was the last time Daniel ever asked. The decades rolled forward like freight trains. Daniel went to college, then medical school, carving a path of his own. He visited home on holidays, polite but distant. His conversations with William shallow. They spoke of the weather, of work, but never of baseball. Elaine, ever gentle, sometimes tried to bridge the gap. "You know, Will," she said softly one evening, "he never stopped waiting for that day. Children remember." William brushed it off, ashamed but unwilling to face it. "It was just a game," he muttered. He grew up fine, yet deep down, he knew it had not been just a game. It had been a symbol of time, of presence, of keeping one's word. It wasn't until William's retirement, nearly 4 decades later, that the weight of the forgotten promise crashed back into his life. Alone in the quiet house after Elaine's passing, William sorted through old boxes in the attic. Inside one, yellowed with age, he found Daniel's childhood glove. Tucked into its leather pocket was a folded scrap of paper, written in a boy's careful hand. "Dad, don't forget. You promised." William sat on the attic floor, paper trembling in his hands. Memories surged: the fireflies, the sunset, the boy with shining eyes. Shame washed over him like cold rain. All those years, he had believed time would cover the promise like dust. But here it was, alive. undeniable. In that moment, William Carter realized that it was not too late. The years had taken much, but they had not yet taken his chance to make things right. So begins the journey of a man determined, in the twilight of his life, to keep a boyhood promise long delayed. What William could not foresee was how fulfilling it would alter not only his son's life, but his own. Daniel Carter grew quickly, as boys often do. But the shadow of that small promise grew with him. By the time he entered high school, the glove that had once fit his hand snugly was stiff and undersized. He no longer asked about the stadium. Instead, he played ball with friends after school, coming home with dust on his shoes and disappointment tucked quietly in his chest. At night, when homework was done and Elaine called for supper, he sometimes lingered by the window, staring down the road as if waiting for a figure that never arrived. William was almost always late. Steel plant shifts ran long, and the promise of overtime meant food on the table and shoes on Daniel's feet. Yet money did not fill the ache of absence. William told himself he was doing the right thing. A man provides, his own father had said. So William worked, shoulders bent under steel beams and long hours. He thought Daniel would understand one day, when he was grown and saw the price of responsibility. But what William never said, what he could barely admit to himself, was that sometimes he avoided home because the weight of his son's expectant eyes was heavier than any beam at the plant. Each time Daniel had asked, "When, Dad?" the guilt inside him sharpened, and instead of facing it, he worked more. Elaine noticed. One evening, as William scrubbed grease from his hands at the sink, she said quietly, "He needs you more than he needs new shoes." William bristled. "I'm doing this for him." "You're doing it for your pride," Elaine said gently. "Don't forget, children, don't measure love in paychecks. They measure it in promises kept." By Daniel's senior year, the distance was visible to anyone. They sat at the same dinner table but spoke as strangers. William asked about grades, about chores, but never about dreams. Daniel answered politely, but his laughter, the laughter that once rang bright on summer evenings, rarely appeared. Friends noticed too. At a diner one night, Daniel's best friend Mark nudged him. "Your dad ever take you to that big game he promised?" Daniel forced a grin. "Nah, guess he forgot." "Or maybe he never meant it," another boy teased. Daniel laughed with him, but later, walking home, he pulled the old glove from his closet and held it in the dark. The leather smelled of dust, and summers passed. He whispered to himself, he meant it. He just forgot. But the whisper held little conviction. Elaine fought to keep father and son connected. She encouraged William to attend Daniel's school games. Sometimes he did, standing awkwardly at the edge of the bleachers, arriving late and leaving early. Daniel saw him, but the presence felt more like duty than devotion. After one game, Daniel scored a winning run. The crowd cheered. Teammates hoisted him up, but when he scanned the sidelines, his father was already gone. Elaine found William later, sitting in the car, staring at the steering wheel. "Why didn't you stay?" she asked. "I had an early shift," he muttered. She touched his arm. "You had a son waiting." When Daniel left for college, the house felt emptier than ever. Elaine hugged him tightly, whispering, "Write often." William shook his hand like a business partner, patting his shoulder stiffly. Daniel smiled, but inside he felt the chasm widen. Letters arrived less frequently as years passed. Daniel buried himself in studies, then in medical school. He told classmates stories of his determined mother, but rarely mentioned his father. When asked, he would shrug. He worked a lot. For William, life became quieter. Elaine still filled the rooms with warmth, but he noticed how her eyes lingered on Daniel's empty chair at dinner. Sometimes she would sigh and say, "You know, he still waits for you to show up in ways that matter." William would nod, but he never found words to bridge the gap. Years blurred into decades. William rose to a foreman at the plant, respected and steady. Yet every achievement rang hollow. He kept the house, paid the bills, But in the silent spaces, he felt the gnawing truth. He had traded presence for provision, and in the trade, he had lost his son's trust. Elaine's passing deepened the emptiness. After the funeral, William sat alone in the living room. On the mantel was a faded photograph Daniel, at 10 years old, glove on his hand, eyes bright with hope. William stared until his vision blurred. For the first time, he whispered aloud, "I promised." The word cracked in his throat like rusted iron breaking. Daniel, now a man in his 40s, had built his own family. Married with a young son, he worked tirelessly as a doctor. He was admired in his community, known for his dedication and empathy. Patients trusted him. Colleagues respected him. Yet privately, he often feared becoming like his father, absent, distracted, always saying next time. He vowed to himself, "I will never break promises to my boy." And yet, when his own son asked to play catch in the park, Daniel sometimes hesitated, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. In those moments, he felt the shadow of William's forgotten promise looming behind him. It was during one of those evenings, when Daniel's son tugged his sleeve, glove in hand, that Daniel suddenly froze. He saw not only his child, but also his younger self, 10 years old, waiting by the porch, eyes full of hope. And he heard again the words, "One day soon, I promise." His chest tightened. He realized he had been on the edge of repeating his father's mistake. In that moment, he dropped everything, grabbed his own glove, and went to the park. Under the glow of street lamps, father and son tossed the ball back and forth, laughter echoing in the twilight. For Daniel, it was more than a game. It was redemption. What Daniel didn't know was that miles away, his father William had found that folded note in the attic. "Dad, don't forget, you promised." And for the first time in decades, William was preparing to make good on his word. Their paths, once divided by silence, were about to collide in a way that would change both of their lives forever. William Carter sat hunched on the bus seat, the hum of the engine vibrating beneath him. Outside the window, fields and towns blurred by, but his mind was caught in the stillness of memory. In his coat pocket, he carried the folded scrap of paper, brittle with age. "Dad, don't forget. You promised." He traced the words with his thumb again and again, as if contact might erase the guilt etched into his heart. He had nearly convinced himself, over the decades, that the promise was forgotten. Work had been a shield, responsibility an excuse. But in the quiet of retirement, the excuses had dissolved, leaving only the truth. He had broken something sacred between himself and his boy. Now, in the final chapter of his life, he felt compelled to try, however late, to mend it. The bus ride took hours, winding through countryside William had not seen in years. He studied fellow passengers, a young mother bouncing a baby, 2 teenagers sharing headphones, an older man reading a newspaper. Each face reflected bonds and commitments, and William wondered how many promises each carried. He closed his eyes, imagining Daniel as a boy, glove in hand, hope shining in his eyes. That image stabbed at him. When the bus pulled into the city station, William gripped the seat to steady himself. His legs were weaker now, but determination pushed him forward. He asked for directions to the hospital where Daniel worked, rehearsing words as he walked. "I failed you. Forgive me. Let me try again." Each phrase tasted inadequate. Meanwhile, Daniel's life spun with relentless speed. At the hospital, he moved from patient to patient, stethoscope cool against weary chests, voice calm even when his own heart carried storms. He was known for his diligence, his compassion, but also for the guarded wall around him. Colleagues sometimes joked that he carried seriousness like a second coat. They did not know that behind the seriousness lived an old wound, a father's forgotten promise. At home, his wife Margaret noticed the heaviness. One evening she asked gently, "Why do you get that faraway look when Nathan brings you his glove?" Daniel sighed. "Because I remember when I was the one asking, and I remember being told next time until I stopped asking." Margaret touched his hand. "You're not your father. I'm afraid of becoming him." Daniel admitted. The following morning, just as Daniel was preparing for work, the doorbell rang. He opened it to see a man older than memory, shoulders stooped, hat in hand. For a long moment, Daniel's mind refused to connect the features with the father he had once known. But then the eyes, the same shade of blue he saw in his own son, anchored recognition. "Dad?" William's voice cracked. "It's me, son. May I come in?" The air seemed to thicken. Nathan peeked from behind Margaret's legs, curious. Margaret, sensing the tension, guided the boy to the kitchen. Daniel stepped aside stiffly. They sat in the living room. William's hands trembled as he pulled the scrap of paper from his coat. "I found this," he said. "Your note. You were 10. I promised I'd take you to a game. I never did. I carried that failure all my life, though I pretended not to. I thought work was enough. I thought time would forgive me. I was wrong." Daniel's jaw tightened. 40 years, Dad. 40 years I waited. Do you know how many times I told my friends about that promise? They laughed. I laughed with them. But inside, I hated you. William bowed his head. I hated myself, too. Daniel's voice rose, sharp. "You think showing up now fixes it?" "No," William whispered. "But maybe showing up now is the only way left to try." That night, after William left, Daniel paced the kitchen. Margaret poured tea, watching him carefully. "He's trying," she said softly. "He's too late," Daniel snapped. Then quieter. "Isn't he?" Margaret reached for his hand. "I don't know, but I know this. Nathan adores you. Don't let your anger at your father turn into the same silence between you and your son." Daniel pressed his palms to his eyes. He remembered the sting of broken promises, the ache of waiting. He didn't want Nathan to inherit that ache. 2 days later, William returned. In his hand were 3 tickets to the local baseball stadium. His voice shook. "Let me keep my promise. Let me take you and Nathan this Saturday." Daniel stared at the tickets, conflict raging inside him. The child within longed to say yes, while the man, scarred and cautious, wanted to say no. But then Nathan darted into the room, eyes bright. "A baseball game? Really?" Daniel looked at his son, then at his father. The decision felt like standing at a crossroads of generations. Finally, he exhaled. "All right, we'll go." Saturday came. The stadium pulsed with live crowds shouting, vendors calling, the scent of popcorn and peanuts drifting on warm air. William walked beside Daniel and Nathan, heart hammering. For him, each step through the gates was both joy and penance. They found their seats. Nathan wriggled with excitement, waving his foam finger. Daniel scanned the field, memories colliding. As a boy, he had dreamed of this exact moment. Imagined the roar of the crowd, the crack of bats, his father beside him. Now, decades later, the dream unfolded late, imperfect, but real. William leaned close. "Danny, I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm here. I kept the promise, even if I kept it badly." Daniel swallowed hard, blinking against tears. "It's not the same, Dad. It'll never be the same." "I know," William said, "but maybe it can still mean something." As the players ran onto the field, Daniel drifted into memory 10 years old, standing in the backyard with his glove, promising his friends that one day his dad would take him. He remembered the teasing, the disappointment, the quiet nights staring at an empty chair. And now, here he was, son on one side, father on the other. The child he had been and the man he had become sat in the same seat, joined in one bittersweet moment. In the 7th inning, a foul ball arced toward their section. The crowd leapt to their feet, hands outstretched. Nathan shouted, "Dad!" Instinctively, Daniel reached up and caught it. The stadium erupted in cheers. He turned, ball in hand, to see his son's eyes shining. William laughed, a deep, genuine laugh Daniel hadn't heard in years. "Would you look at that?" he said. clapping Daniel on the back. "You finally caught the one we were waiting for." Daniel looked at the ball, then at his father. In that moment, anger loosened its grip, replaced by something fragile: acceptance, maybe even forgiveness. As the crowd roared and Nathan hugged his father and grandfather, Daniel realized the game was more than sport. It was a bridge, however late, across a chasm of silence. But when the cheering died down and the lights dimmed, a harder question lingered. Could a single promise kept at last heal 40 years of promises broken? The answer would come in what followed. The game ended beneath a sky streaked with violet and gold. The last cheer from the crowd lingered in the humid summer air as William, Daniel, and young Nathan filed out with the throng. Vendors called their final sales. Children waved foam fingers, and the smell of popcorn still clung to their jackets. Nathan held the foul ball tight to his chest as if it were a crown jewel. His face glowed, cheeks flushed with excitement. For William, the weight he had carried for decades seemed, for a moment, to lift. Yet even in his joy, he felt the ache of time lost. He glanced sideways at Daniel, who walked silently with his hands shoved into his pockets. The boy who had once waited on a porch was now a grown man with gray at his temples. William's chest constricted with both pride and regret. They slid into Daniel's car. Nathan, buckled in the back seat, bubbled with chatter, replaying every pitch and swing. He described the crack of the bat, the way the ball soared, the moment his father caught it. William listened with moist eyes, grateful to hear the sound of a child's joy, a sound that once belonged to Daniel and should have been his to nurture. Daniel kept his focus on the road. The city lights blurred past, neon flashing across the windshield. Silence stretched between father and son, heavy yet different from the old silences. This one was not filled with anger, but with fragile possibility. At a red light, William cleared his throat. "Thank you for letting me come today." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. "It was for Nathan, I know," William said, voice low. "But it meant everything to me too." The light turned green. The car rolled forward, carrying 3 generations into the night, into the fragile beginnings of a new chapter. When they arrived home, Margaret greeted them at the door. She hugged Nathan, listening as he retold the game with wild gestures, nearly dropping the ball in his excitement. Then her eyes fell on William. She gave him a long look, soft, cautious, but not cold. Later, after Nathan was asleep, Margaret found Daniel standing at the kitchen counter, the ball resting in front of him. He turned it slowly in his hands, lost in thought. "He's trying," Margaret whispered. Daniel shook his head, but his voice trembled. "Part of me still feels like that boy waiting, hoping, hearing the word tomorrow until it meant nothing." Margaret touched his arm gently. "Then maybe it's time to tell that boy inside you that he doesn't have to wait anymore." The next morning, William asked Daniel to sit with him on the porch. The wood creaked under their weight, just as it had decades ago. The air smelled faintly of dew and lilac from Margaret's garden. "I don't have many years left," William began, staring at his weathered hands. "And I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know the truth. I thought being a father meant paying bills, keeping food on the table. I thought promises could wait. I was wrong. What you needed wasn't my paycheck, it was me." Daniel's throat tightened. He had longed to hear those words, even when he stopped believing he ever would. "I can't give you back your childhood," William continued, voice breaking, "but I can give you this. Whatever time I have left, I will spend it keeping my word. No more broken promises." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of 4 decades pressing down. Then Daniel whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I want to try." That night, Daniel sat alone in his study. The foul ball rested on the desk beside patient charts and medical journals. He stared at it until tears blurred his vision. The ball wasn't just leather and stitches. It was proof that even broken promises could be mended, if only in part. He thought of Nathan tugging at his sleeve, glove in hand. He thought of his own 10-year-old self, waiting on the porch, and he realized he stood at a crossroads. He could repeat his father's mistakes, or he could break the cycle. Daniel rose quietly, walked into Nathan's room, and kissed his sleeping son's forehead. He whispered, "I'll always show up for you." Nathan stirred, half asleep, and mumbled, "Thanks, Dad." In that small moment, Daniel felt the chain of silence finally snap. Weeks passed. William began visiting more often, sitting with Nathan in the backyard, teaching him how to oil his glove, telling him stories of the old steel plant. Nathan listened wide-eyed, proud to have a grandfather who spoke of furnaces and molten fire as if they were dragons tamed by men. But age pressed hard on William. His cough deepened, his steps slowed. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he called Daniel and Margaret to his side. Nathan perched on the edge of the bed, still clutching the foul ball. William's voice was faint but steady. "That ball, it's more than a souvenir. It's proof that promises matter, even when they come late. Don't waste the time you're given. Keep your word while you still can." He placed Nathan's small hand around the ball. "This is yours now. Remember, your father and I both love you. Carry that love, not our mistakes." Nathan nodded, sensing the weight of the moment. When William passed peacefully days later, Daniel felt sorrow but not bitterness. The anger that once shadowed every memory had lifted, replaced by a fragile peace. At the funeral, Daniel stood before family and friends, the foul ball in his hand. "My father was not perfect," he said, voice steady. "He made mistakes. He broke promises. And for many years, I carried that wound. But in the end, he taught me the most important lesson of all, that promises, however small, are sacred, and keeping them even late can change a life." The church fell silent. Margaret wept softly. Nathan, sitting in the front pew, held the ball tightly, his young heart imprinted with the lesson of 2 generations. Time moved forward. Nathan grew tall, his glove worn from countless games of catch. Daniel kept his vow, never missing a game, a recital, or a bedtime story. Whenever life threatened to pull him away, he remembered his father's late redemption. One evening, years later, Nathan asked, "Dad, why do you never break promises?" Daniel smiled, tears glimmering in his eyes. "Because I know how much they matter. Once, my father reminded me, better late than never, that keeping your word can change everything." Nathan grinned, tossing the ball in the air. "Then I'll keep mine too." And in that moment, Daniel knew the cycle had been broken. Every promise we make writes itself into the heart of someone we love. Time may blur it, life may bury it, but it never disappears. A child remembers. A spouse remembers. And when a promise is finally kept even decades later, it carries the power to heal wounds, to restore dignity, to rewrite stories thought already finished. Think about the promises you've made. To your children, your parents, your friends, even to yourself. Which ones are still waiting? Which ones deserve to be honored before time runs out? It is never too late. The game may be in its final innings, the stands nearly empty, but keeping your word can still change the score. Share your own story in the comments about a promise you kept or one you're still waiting to fulfill. Subscribe to Years Ago Stories for more forgotten promises, untold truths, and lessons that echo across generations. Because in the end, what we leave behind is not our wealth or possessions. It is the promises we kept, the love we showed, and the stories our families tell long after we are gone.